Hello, what's up y'all? Today I am going over how I made this painting. I'm also super duper pregnant. I'm like 2 days out for my due date, 3 days out for my due date. And yeah, I'm ready for this to be over, but I thought I would distract myself by painting some time lapses and talking through them today. So yeah, I painted this guy. I don't exactly know the dimensions. I think like 11 by 14, maybe a little bit bigger. But I do it with acrylics. I'm using Golden and Liquitex heavy body acrylic paints. And yeah, I talk through my process and kind of go over what I'm aiming for. As you can tell, it's sort of a brushier, impressionistic vibe. But if you pull it back and squint your eyes, it kind of looks realistic. I don't know. People always ask my style, and that's it in a nutshell. Like, kind of realistic, but not really. So anyways, I talked through that, and yeah, should be a good video. Thank you for being here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for keeping me entertained in these hopefully last few days of pregnancy. So yeah, enjoy the video, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Bye. Okay, so I'm starting off like normal, just adding in the phthalo blue and white mixture I use for drawing. I'm painting on top of cadmium red or like a cadmium orange, I can't remember, but yeah, so this is always kind of how I start out. I just like this combo. It's contrasty and it's worked for me so far, so I just stick with it. But the point is that you want to tone with something medium value, and then you want to go in with a somewhat contrasting paint to draw in your image. So I'm just sort of checking relationships to each object. So I'm using established forms like the placement of the watermelon to measure the other objects. But mostly at this point, I'm kind of just freehanding. And then I'm mixing in yellow and white to give myself a different color to go clean up and check some of those initial shapes I put down. It's really hard to get the placement of the first objects you draw in the first go, at least for me. So yeah, just checking now, making sure everything aligns well and is somewhat accurate. Now I'm mixing up my darkest value, which is the shadow of the coffee, and it looks like the pit of the peach and maybe some of the shadow on the bundles say. So I'm just adding that in there. I'm not going for perfectly accurate because I'm working in acrylics, and so I understand that I will be building up different layers. So if you notice that I'm putting everything in really messy, it's because it'll dry and I'll be able to paint on top of it later. So I'm just establishing general shapes and values at this point. I have a set of translucent glasses that have I probably just mixed up a little bit of red Kool-Aid and water and made it pink, but I'm going for like kind of a rosé look. And so to paint those in, it's a lot of like just painting in those various shades of pink. And instead of working through value this time, I'm really just going through and painting everything that is in that same pinkish, reddish, orange family. So now I'm just trying to get the shadow of the peach painted in, and it went kind of green because I cooled it with a nice blue shade. And so I'm able to then use that green and pivot and do the rind of the watermelon. So the thinking is just whatever's on your brush, you sort of want to just check and see if you can use that paint somewhere else in the composition. Making sure not to do too much blending at this point. There's definitely opportunities where blending would work, but at this early of the process, I usually try to hold myself back from doing any kind of fancy blending, just because things are always still so subject to change at this point in the painting. you know, even my drawing, I may go through in a few minutes after I get everything marked in and decide that the drawing is really off, and then I would just draw over it and move things. So I'm really trying to not become too attached to anything. So I'm just treating it really, really generalized. And this part's always fun. I'm just blocking in the background. When I took this painting, or the photo for the painting, I just used like a piece of foam board that I just have in my studio, and I use it to reflect light when I take photos, and I use it for a backdrop. Basically, if it gets dirty, I just kind of paint over it. It's like a really old board. But anyways, I use that as my backdrop because I really like playing with the shadows on the white background. I can make them really distinct. I also think that it just looks really nice and crisp and kind of gives the still life a graphic feel. It's really just like a stylistic choice, but yeah, so I was just using a white foam board to put everything on, and that's what I just painted in. And now I'm going in with the shadows. It's really tempting with shadows to just go in with one color and use it for everything. But if you can kind of take a second to look at your shadows and really investigate the different values in there, I think it really helps your painting look more put together than if you just sort of say, okay, I'm going to paint everything a bluish gray and just approximate. The trick with painting is that you want to always make sure that you're actually finding colors and values instead of just guessing that that's what a shadow does or that's how a shadow works. So even with this shadow, I'm noticing that the undertone is a little more green, and then it's a little bit closer to a true blue, and then right next to the flesh of the watermelon, it's almost like a pink. So shadows are interesting because they reflect not only the ground they're painted on, but they also reflect the objects adjacent to it. So the shadow of the flesh of the watermelon is going to read completely different than the rind, even though they're kind of in the same spot and blocking the same amount of light. I always think that's really interesting. And now that I have everything marked in, I'm just going in right now to maybe look for different details or more information in the composition. At this point, you can go in and like redraw over if you've gotten some really wonky things happening from your initial draw in, or maybe you didn't get something really accurate the first time you drew in your painting. This would be a great time to go and fix those things, but I'm pretty comfortable with how accurate it is. I think I'm pretty close, so I'm going to instead just dive right in. And so I'm trying to find the value changes in the watermelon, and even the color changes. I find that there's like usually this kind of like whiter, lighter, more washed out pink in watermelon, and then there's really saturated parts of the watermelon. So I'm just looking for those. And again, with this glass, capturing the reflected light is usually about just finding the little tiny details and, you know, where the glass is kind of creating those nice purpley, violety shadows, where they're more clear and there's no liquid. So just, you know, people ask me, how do you paint glasses? How do you paint translucent things? And the truth is really just those objects specifically, you have to like really look for the variations in value and color and know that they change a lot more than like a piece of watermelon, for instance, which if I had just blocked in a melon colored value over the whole thing, it would still work, but there's no way you can get away with just 1 or 2 values in a glass. You really have to look and look hard. So that's all I'm doing here. The nice thing about putting the background value in, so that nice white background, is that I can make value choices with the lighter, the objects that are lighter value, a little bit more accurately. I noticed that when I go through and I haven't painted the white background in, it's really hard for me to figure out how light I should make something like, for instance, the white part of the bagel. So once I get that background in, it's a lot easier to get that more accurately. So yeah, just doing more of the same thing, looking for different values and colors, and I've moved down to smaller brushes at this point, so I'm getting more detail in, but I'm still not really rendering yet. I'm still kind of saying that everything is subject to a little bit of change from this point on. So like I just put the orange around the flesh of the peach, but I made that line way too thick because I know that later I'll come back and carve it out with like a lighter yellow color. So one thing I've noticed when I've painted citrus before, or like citrus slices, is that it's really easy to go overboard and over render. Usually there's not a ton of value change in citrus, even though like with our eyes we can very distinctly see the lines. I would urge you, especially if you're newer, like less is more when it comes to painting citrus, and just barely hint at the lines. And that's typically the best bet to not overworking citrus. So like I said a minute ago, like I knew I would go back with yellow and kind of clean up what I was doing earlier. So when I'm painting, I'm sort of thinking of every mark as a placeholder. And sometimes the placeholders end up being really nice and I'll keep them, but usually everything I'm sort of thinking, okay, I'll come back to you, like I'll keep working on you. And even if I don't, like it keeps me from overworking one section of the painting at a time. So I'm just bouncing around to different objects instead of fully rendering one object at a time. Going in and adding darker values to the pan dulce, or specifically these are called like conchas, and it's seashell in Spanish, and it's because they kind of look like little seashells. I love these sweetbreads. Like if you live near Mexico, or I think they may have them all over Central and South America, but they are delicious. They're not like donuts, but they're like milder. The bread is really good and light and fluffy, and like when I moved to Austin, it was the first time I had a concha, and like it was so good. I just remember I don't have much of a sweet tooth, and so these are like a nice mild pastry to have, and it's really good with like a strong coffee, and then you dunk it, and then at the very bottom like there's sugar. It's just like a whole experience basically. If you ever get a chance to try like an authentic concha from like a mom and pop shop, you should definitely go for it. They're so delicious. Never had one until I moved to Austin, but yeah, they are so good. We have so many great little local like pan shops around, and they're so good. But yeah, I'm just looking for the different values. I've painted these conchas a lot, and I find that if you slowly build up the value until you get to the most lit part where the sugar is, it kind of gives it a more realistic look. So that's what I was trying to do there. I'm just finishing up my coffee. Try to find those little highlights in there. So I would consider this part like on sort of the finishing stage. I'm sort of just like, I'm really happy with the way most everything is at this point. I'm just adding little highlights or last little pieces of information. But yeah, I'm at the finishing stage. So it looks like I'm going to go back over the outline. So this is good for a couple of reasons. One is it kind of helps you clean up your drawing a little bit when you paint, especially when you're using bigger brushes. It's hard to stay really accurate, so a lot of times your found shapes become a little bit, they sort of morph as you put paint down, and I find that this method gives you a chance to clean up some of those drawing mistakes. And then also, because the background is truly like a stark white, it's sort of bringing the value up. I could have done this bright the last step, but I always try to save it. I'd rather work a little bit harder later and be really confident in my value choices than trying to get a shortcut and do this step earlier and then like blowing out my value. And it's really hard to make your values like darker and then just bringing them up, I find. So that's why I'm doing some steps twice, and it's fun. I really like this process, so like I'm not in a rush. This is my me time, so if I have to do something twice, it's no problem. Going in with just one more layer of value on my little pastry. And again, I just sort of see with the color I have mixed up if I can put that anywhere else on the canvas. So I was able to use some of that pink to add more transparency to those glasses. Again, with the citrus, I'm just sort of hinting those little membranes in there instead of really rendering them out. And this bagel, I remember I took this photo a long time ago, but it has like an orange marmalade on it instead of like a jam, and so I found that a little bit tricky to render, but I'm just trying to make it look glowy, and you know, if someone mistakes it for butter, that's fine, but just really trying to find those little shapes in there. But I remember this being kind of tricky when I was doing it. information to the rind, trying to make it look a little more realistic. For the actual highlights. It's so easy to overdo this step, especially when you're a new painter. I don't know why. It's like everyone's Achilles heel, but yeah, I'm just adding them in, trying to be sparingly, but I love adding in the highlights, so I get carried away sometimes too. Even after all these years, I totally do that. But yeah, I'm just trying to see if there's any last little levels of detail that I can add in. And if you notice, this is the first time I'm using like a really small brush. I've been using pretty big brushes up until this point, even with the detail. So yeah, there is a place for teeny tiny brushes, but the more successful paintings I do usually are the ones that I can have a little bit of restraint and paint with larger brushes for as long as possible. So I must have been checking, usually highlight is my last step. I mean, it's never a perfect formula, but generally my highlights are my last step. So I must have taken a step back and looked at it, and the shadow on the plate must have bothered me or something, because I decided to kind of go rework it, which I'm glad I did. One thing, if you have two large white, surfaces or plates or something, try, even if the undertones are similar in real life, to differentiate them a little bit. Like I pulled this one a little bit more neutral purple, and the background that I painted on the foam board, I pulled a little bit more yellow. I added ochre to it, so that way they don't like run into each other. Not that would be the end of the world, but it's just something I didn't want to have happen. So yeah, there's the finished product. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and check out my YouTube channel. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.